Hilchos Maachalos Asuros Perek Shishi, the laws of forbidden foods, chapter 6. Today we move on to yet another topic. Each chapter in these laws deals with a separate forbidden food or forbidden substance that we're not allowed to eat. And today's topic is blood. And while it sounds pretty distant and out of our reality, we don't typically consume blood straight up. However, it is very, very relevant in the way that we produce kosher meat. In order to be able to eat meat, we need to salt it. There's a whole process that's going to be described in today's chapter. So actually, this prohibition of blood has some real life ramifications. And let's get right into it, discuss all the details. Halacha Aleph, ha'oichel kazayis min hadam. If somebody eats an olive-sized portion of blood, b'mezid, if they do so willfully, purposely, chayav kares, they're liable to excision. That's how strict it is. B'sheigeg, if they do so inadvertently, they're unaware that it's blood, or they're unaware that eating blood is forbidden. Mevi chatas kvua, they have to bring what's called the standard sin offering. There are other sin offerings that you bring that fluctuate based on a person's financial means. But typically you bring what's called the chatas kvua, the standard sin offering. It's interesting that Rambam uses the expression eating for blood. You should say one who drinks blood. And he actually also uses the amount that's usually associated with food. In halacha, when we talk about drinking, usually the requisite amount for drinking is always a revi'it, a quarter of a log. With food, it's a kazayit. All the foods that we've been talking about till now, limbs from a living animal, carcasses, treifa, non-kosher animals, it's always a kazayis. Here the Rambam describes the act of consuming blood as eating, and he also uses the requisite amount for eating. And the commentaries talk about this at length. The Rebbe once delivered a talk more on a homiletical level, explaining the connection, because one of the reasons that differentiates food from drink is because of their purpose. Food is about feeding the body, giving it the proper nutrition. Drinking is usually about moving the food about the body in the right place. That's why, in general, the amount for eating is less than the amount for drinking. Kazayat is smaller than a revi'it, because for eating you need less to bring nutrition. For drinking you need more for it to accomplish its purpose. But since ultimately the whole idea of food is to turn into blood, to go into the bloodstream and properly feed our blood, so blood is directly linked to food, and in that way also in halacha it expresses itself in that consuming blood is called eating, and it's also measured by the amounts of eating. An interesting take. V'davar mefurish b'Torah, it's a matter that's explicit in the Torah, says the Rambam, she'enei chayav ela al dam behema chayav va'oif bilvad, that you're only liable for the blood of animals, beasts, or birds. Bein tmei and bein tahirim, whether impure or pure, kosher or non-kosher. Shenemar, as it says, this is the primary verse which deals with blood, the top verse on the screen. V'chol dam lo yiseichlu b'chil meshvei seichem. All blood you shall not eat in all of your dwelling places, la'oif v'la behema, from birds and from animals. V'chaya v'chlal behema. And we know that beasts, undomesticated animals, are included in the Torah's terminology. When Torah says the word behema, it includes both behema and chaya. How do we know that? Shenemar, because it says in the bottom verses in the screen, when Moshe introduces the laws of kashrus, the laws of keeping kosher, he says, Zeis ha-behema asher teichelu. This is the animal that you should eat. And it begins with shayr, the oxen, which is a regular behema, a regular domesticated animal. But then the very next verse lists ayol, utzvi, v'goymer. A gazelle, a deer, those are chayas. And yet the heading is the word behema. From here we see that when Torah uses the word behema, it includes as an umbrella both behemas and chayas. So going back to the other verse, if it says you cannot consume blood from birds and from behemas, it means from both behemas and chayas. So that precludes all blood from animals, beasts, and birds. Avol dam dagim v'chagavim, but let's say the blood from fish, or the blood from locusts, ushkatzim urimasim, or the blood from insects, creepy crawly teeming animals, v'dam ha'adam, and human blood, ein chayavin alav mishum dam. You're not held liable on account of consuming blood. There'll be other issues in certain cases, but not for blood. Lefichach, therefore, dam dagim v'chagavim tehirim. If we're talking about kosher fish or kosher locusts, mutar la'achlai, it's straight up permitted to eat it. Ba'afilu kinsei b'kli v'shasahu, mutar. Even if you gathered a whole bunch of fish blood, a whole bunch of locust blood into a cup, and you drank it, that's allowed, mutar, totally permitted. In the Shulchan Aruch it mentions that you should have scales in the blood to show that it's from fish. But according to the Rambam, just straight up, if it's fish blood, it's totally fine. V'dam chagavim v'dagim tmeim aser. Yet, if it's blood from non-kosher locust or non-kosher fish, then it's forbidden. Mishum shu tamtzias gufan, because the blood is part of their body, and their body is forbidden on a different account, on account of not consuming non-kosher species. Not going to hold you liable for blood, but we are going to hold you liable for consuming a non-kosher species because the blood is part of their body. Kachalev behemat tmeya, much like the milk of a non-kosher animal is forbidden, as we saw the other day, so too the blood from a non-kosher locust or a non-kosher fish is also forbidden. The dam shkatzim kibsaran, as well as the blood of insects, is like their flesh, kamesha biarnu, as we explained. Dam ha'adam, human blood, while biblically it's permitted, asur midivrei seifrim im peirash. If it left the body, it's forbidden rabbinically. Umakin olav makas mardos, and the rabbis can give rabbinic lashes for one who consumes it. Aval dam hashinayim, but let's say blood from the teeth. It didn't leave the mouth, it didn't leave the body. Boilei ve'enei nimna, you can swallow it without even needing to hold back, it's totally fine. But let's say the person bites into a bread. He bites into a sandwich. And then he finds some blood from his gums, let's say, on the bread. At this point, the blood has already left the body. It's already separated, so you have to scrape off the blood from the bread and then continue eating Shaharei Peidash, for it has already separated. The Rebbe in another talk dealt with this difference between human blood, animal blood, bigger animals, smaller animals, why some are forbidden, some are permitted, also on a Kabbalistic level, in which blood represents energy. Blood represents chayut. And the negative forces are always looking to draw chayut, to draw energy from that which is holy and kosher and pure. So the bigger an animal is, the more energy it's present in it. And so its blood can be converted into something negative, and so we're forbidden to eat it. When it's smaller, the blood is just feeding the creature. Doesn't have any energy to be drawn out from it for the negative forces. Therefore, the smaller species, the locusts and the teeming animals, technically the blood would be permitted. What about the human being? It's the greatest of the great. It has the most energy. We're the most susceptible to negative forces influencing us. So the Rebbe says counterintuitively, that's why it's forbidden rabbinically. In the Midrash it says, Chamurim divrei sofrim yoter mi divrei Torah. The words enacted by the rabbis are in some ways more stringent than the words that are simply scriptural and biblical. So by the sages imposing a prohibition, they're intimating that the prohibition of human blood is in some ways even harsher than the prohibition of regular animal and bird's blood, Kabbalistically meaning we're more prone to the negative forces taking hold of us, and therefore we should stay away and make sure that to direct all of our energy and all of our warmth and all of our enthusiasm to holy things. Halacha Gimel ein chayavin kares. When it comes to the blood that we're liable to excision, we're only liable ella al dam hayotze bishas shchita unechira. Only on the blood that's called in the Torah the blood of the soul, the blood that exits an animal at the moment of slaughter or the moment of it being ripped open, or hatazas haresh, or the moment of its beheading. Kol zman sheyesh b'admumis, so long as the blood has a deep red tinge. Ve'al hadam hakonos b'soy chalev. We're also liable for the blood that gathers in the heart. It's also a very, very deep blood. Ve'al dam hakaza, and also blood that comes out of an animal during bloodletting. Kol zman shu mekaleach v'yoytze, as long as it's spurting out forcefully. In bloodletting, there was like an opening process. You kind of ease into it. The blood is dripping out. Then it drips out forcefully, and then it comes again to ease as the end of the bloodletting process approaches. So the Rambam says when it comes to bloodletting blood, you're only liable to the blood as it spurts out forcefully. Aval hadam hashayses bitchilas hakaza. Koydem sheyaschel lekaleach, but the blood which drips out before or at the beginning of the bloodletting, before the spurting begins, v'dam hashayses besoif hakaza. Kasheyaschel adam lifsoik, as well as the blood that drips out at the end of the bloodletting, when the blood is beginning to ease out and stop. Ein chayavin alav, you're not held liable for consuming such blood. V'harehu kedam ha'ivardim, it's like any other blood in the limbs of the animal, whose laws will be delineated shortly. Shadam hakiluach hu hadam shahanefesh yaitzabay, because it's only the blood which spurts out, either during slaughtering or during bloodletting, which the soul exits through it, and that's the terminology the Torah uses, blood of the soul. Dam hatamtzis v'dam ha'ivarim. Dam hatamtzis means concentrated blood, but it's a reference to the blood that flows slowly after slaughter out of an animal after most of its major blood arteries have been emptied. Dam ha'evarim is blood in the limbs, blood that remains in the rest of the flesh, the muscle, and all the limbs of the animal. Going dam ha'tchel, v'dam ha'kloyes, v'dam beitzim, like the blood of the spleen, the blood of the kidneys, the blood in the testicles, the dam ha'miskanis lalev b'shas shchita, as well as the blood that that gathers in the heart during the moment of slaughtering. V'dam hanimtza b'kaved, and any blood discovered in the liver, ein chayav en olav kares, one who eats this blood is not liable to excision. Aval lo'ichal mimenu kazayis loike. If you eat a olive-sized portion of it, you will get lashes. It's totally biblically prohibited. Shanemar, because it says v'chol dam lo yisaychlu. All blood you shall not eat. All blood you shall not eat means all blood will hold you liable to the prohibition. However, the verse that describes the liability to excision, it says, Ki nefesh habasar badamhi. The reason you shouldn't eat blood is because the soul of the flesh is in the blood, which means you're only liable, you're only going to be liable to excision for consuming blood through which the soul exits. The slaughtered blood, the spurting bloodletting blood. Those are the ones that carry the soul energy. The other ones are prohibited on a different account, different prohibition, lashes, but no excision. Halacha hey, hashlil hanimtza b'me'ei habehema, an unborn fetus discovered in the womb of an animal, which we discussed yesterday at the end of the chapter, about how it's permitted kosher to be eaten in some cases even without ritual slaughter. Harei damai kedam hayiloid. Its blood is like the blood of a fully born fetus, a fully born young animal. Lefichach, therefore, hadam hanimtza kanus b'seich libay. Blood that is found to be gathered in its heart, chayav en olav kares. You're liable to excision for it. That's part of the blood that carries the soul. Aval shar dame, but any other blood, harei kedam ha'ivrim, is like the blood in the rest of an animal's limbs and is liable to lashes, but not to excision. Halev, says the Rambam, now we need to talk about the process that will allow for consumption of the animal. Because blood of an animal is forbidden at differing levels, but definitely at a negative prohibition, even sometimes for excision, if you want to consume part of the animal's meat, you're going to have to go through a process of making sure that the blood is no longer left in those limbs. And the Rambam will go through some of the major limbs and then talk about meat in general. We begin with the heart. Halev, an animal heart, a bird heart, bein litzali, bein likdeira. Whether you want to use it for roasting or to be cooked, kaira yomaitzi as damai. You must first cut it open and remove the blood. There's a whole bunch of blood that's gathered in it. By cutting it open, the major blood leaves. In addition to that, va'achar kach moilcha, you have to also salt it. The salting will extract any of the other blood that's inside the heart. If you cook the heart without tearing it open, then after the fact, you can cut it open after the cooking and it'll still be permitted. The commentaries point to the statement of the Talmud that the heart's insides are very smooth and do not absorb the blood. The Aramaic word is shani leiv de shia. The heart is smooth. And so according to the Rambam, even if you cooked the heart with its blood, the blood will never get absorbed into the walls of the heart's meat itself. And therefore, after the fact, you can tear it open and have the blood be released afterwards. However, if you didn't tear up the heart even after the fact, you simply ate it with all of its blood. So the Rambam says, then in one specific case, that brings the level of prohibition down, and you're not going to be liable to excision for consuming the blood. When are we talking about? A bird heart, which doesn't carry an olive-sized portion of blood. But were it to be the heart of an animal, and you cooked it, and you didn't tear it open even afterwards, and you ate it, chayav kares, you'd be liable to excision, because you've now consumed an olive-sized portion of the blood inside the heart, shechayav en olav kares, which is one of the bloods that holds you liable to excision, even though you cooked it. This is quite a novelty of the Rambam. According to many other authorities, once you cook blood, while it's prohibited, the prohibition goes down a level from biblical to rabbinic. According to the Rambam here, even though you cook the heart, but if it has enough to be an olive-sized portion, you're liable scripturally to excision. That's as far as the heart goes. Now says the Rambam halacha zayin hakavet, liver. And this is much more common today. We do eat liver. Heart's not so common to find being sold in the markets. But animal liver, chicken liver, these are stuff that we eat on a day-to-day. And there's a special rule about the liver because, as the Shulchan Aruch says, the liver is full of blood. You can't just salt it to extract the blood. It requires much more. Says the Rambam, im chatacha v'hishlicha l'soicha chaimetz. If you were to first cut it open to do a basic release of the blood, and then you throw it into vinegar that's boiling, or to boiling water, ad shetislabe, until it turns white, you scald it in the water. This is called chalita in halachic literature. Harezu muteres levashel oisa achar kain. Then, and only then, is it permitted to cook it afterwards? Because, as the commentaries explain, the chalita process, the scalding process, seals off any pores in the blood vessels in the liver, and will not, even if there is any blood left, that blood won't move around. The only time you're liable for eating blood, when it comes to the blood of the limbs, the blood that's in the animal, is if it moves from place to place within the meat, which typically happens as a result of cooking, or it's not in its natural place. If you seal off those pores by putting it into scalding water, now, once you go ahead and roast it or cook it later, that blood will not emerge. But you first must cut it open and scald it. Today, the Shulchan Aruch rules that we're not expert in the scalding process, so we don't even use it. But the Rambam discusses it. And he uses it as a means of permitting even cooking. Most commentaries, most authorities say you can only roast the liver, you can't even cook it. The Rambam says if you scald it, that's enough to cook it. However, most Jews already have the custom lahavhava al ha'ur, to at least singe it over the fire, and only then cook it. Bein shabishla levada, bein shabishla in basar achar, and cooking it can be done whether by itself, whether with other meat. Again, today, we don't do this. Today, we only roast liver, and we roast it usually by itself. We don't want it to be together with other meat. We want all its blood to drain out, and that's it. But the Rambam gives the scenario where it's possible to cook it. V'chein minag pashut, it's also a common custom, she'ein mevashlin hamayach shel reish, v'loi kailin oisai, that we do not cook the brains of an animal or roast them ad shemehava v'noisai behur, till they're first singed over a fire to do a basic extraction of some of the blood. Halacha ches hakaved shabishla v'loi hivhava al ha'ur. Were you to cook a liver without singeing it over the fire, v'loi chalota b'chay metzai bereischin, or without scalding it in vinegar or in hot water, harei hakadeira kula asura, the entire pot is forbidden. Hakaved v'chol is bashalima, the liver and everything cooked with it. There's blood in there, it's gotten into the food and it's prohibited it. Umutar litzles kaved im habasar b'shapud echad, it's permitted to roast liver and meat on one spit, v'hu shatia hakaved lamata, so long as the liver is on the bottom. Because the liver's blood is more powerful. Were it to be on the top, we're worried it would be absorbed into the meat. If it's on the bottom of the meat, it's okay. Even after the fact, even if you did roast it above the meat, you could eat it. Because we say that the blood will just slip off the meat. It won't be absorbed into the meat. While blood is being exuded, it becomes very slippery and it will slip off the meat. Halacha tes hatchoil, the spleen. This is an actual cow spleen. Mutar levashle afilu imabasar, it's permitted to cook it even with meat. She'enei dam, spleen is not blood. Elabasar hadoim eladam, it's flesh that looks like blood. Hashover mafrekes behema kedem shtetzei nafsha, says the Rambam an important rule. If somebody breaks the neck of an animal before its soul expires, harei hadam nivla ba'evarim, the reflex to that in the animal's body is to cause blood to be swallowed into many of the limbs. And therefore, v'asur lechol mimena basar chai v'afilu chalotai, you will not be able to eat live, raw meat, even if you scald it, because the blood, by virtue of the breaking of the neck, has already moved from place to place within the limbs, and that itself is a cause for prohibition. So even if you're now going to go and seal it by scalding, it doesn't help for the blood that already moved from place to place. Ela ketzad yaseh, rather, what should you do? Yachtech hachaticha, you must cut open the piece that you want to eat, v'yimlach yafe yafe, and salt it very well, the achar kach yavasha lo yitzle, and only then cook or roast the piece. Ukvar b'yarno, we've already explained. Sha'ashechet behema chaya v'oif v'layatza mihen dam she'en mutarid. Were you to slaughter an animal, beast, or bird with no blood coming out of them, they are permitted. The Rambam repeats this law here to emphasize his point. Only when you break the neck of an animal is that when the blood moves from place to place, and is that when all the meat is forbidden. But in a case of slaughtering and no blood emerges, it's permitted even on that count. We're not worried that some of the blood inside the animal may have moved from place to place. It remains totally permitted. Halacha Yud, the Rambam now addresses the meat of the animal in general. We're done with specific limbs. Now we're moving to all the rest of the meat. Ein habasar yotze midei damai. Meat of an animal, meat of a bird, doesn't rid itself of its blood completely. Elohim kein moilcha yafe yafe umedicha yafe yafe. Unless you salt it very well and wash it very well. There's a washing, salting process that is required for every piece of meat or chicken to undergo before it becomes kosher. This is done till today. I couldn't find a really good picture online, but here you see a massive piece of meat that's being salted in preparation. It's done in mass, it's done in a big counter. They salt tons of pieces at once many times. Chicken, meat, all of it has to be salted before it's kosher. That's why, by the way, kosher chicken and meat is much more salty the non-kosher chicken and meat because it goes through the salting process to extract its blood. And the salting process involves both soaking in water and salting. Keitzad oiseh, how do you do it? The Rambam describes his method of salting. Mediach habasar tchila. First of all, you wash the meat. Today's day and age, we rule in Shulchan Aruch, it should actually not just be washed, but soak for at least a half an hour. And then you salt it very well. Salt it on both sides, salt it all over the place. With good salt, as we'll soon see. You leave it in the salt, the time it takes to walk a meal, about 18 to 24 minutes. The Rambam goes to the stricter opinion, about 24 minutes. Today we leave it in the salt for an hour. And then you wash it again after the salting is over. And you keep on washing till the water is clear. So there's no trace of any more blood or any more salt. According to the Rambam, after the salting process is over, you must scald it. Throw the piece right away into hot water, not lukewarm or warm water, so that it whitens and no more blood can come out. You seal off the pores. Even if there is any more blood left, nothing is going to exit anymore. And then it's permitted to eat it. Today it's a little bit more detailed. Again, they wash it before soaking it for half an hour. They salt it for an hour. They wash it again afterwards. Some wash it even twice afterwards. Some do 3 times afterwards. The point is many, many rounds of washing, and the salting stays there for a good long time to extract all the blood. By the way, as a complete aside, many people who have their issues with the Orthodox world use today's scientific data to show that even after you salt the meat, there's still pieces of blood that remain in the meat. And they use it to say, oh, you see, the salting methods of the sages don't work, and it's pointless. Anyways, going to be blood in the meat, so the whole kosher salting thing is bogus. But what they fail to understand is that the whole purpose of salting the meat, is to extract any blood that may later move around in the cooking process, because it's only blood that moves around from place to place within the meat that becomes forbidden via cooking. Blood that will stay in its place even after cooking is permitted, like we've seen. You scald it. You scald the meat, it seals the blood off. When it stays in its place, it's going to be permitted. So by the same token, today, whatever blood the salting doesn't extract is going to stay in its place. That's why it wasn't extracted, because it stayed there, it's so firm. And even cooking won't extract it. So it's going to remain totally fine. And hence, of course, the kosher salting procedures of our sages is completely has complete efficacy, is totally true, and we're going to follow it B'ezrat Hashem till Mashiach comes and even beyond. Halacha Yud Aleph Kesher Melchin Habasar, when we salt meat, Ein Melchin Noisei Ela B'Kli Menukav, we only salt it in a utensil with holes, so the blood drains out. Otherwise, the blood will gather, and we worry that it may reabsorb into the meat, which will cause the meat to become forbidden. Ve'ein Melchin Ela B'Melech Aveh Kechel Hagas, we also only salt using coarse salt, thick salt, that's like thick sand. Shahamelach dak kekemach, because were we to use salt that's thin like flour, yibala babasar v'leyetzidam, we're worried that it may actually be absorbed into the meat and not do its opposite purpose, which is to extract the blood from the meat. After the salting process is over, one needs to shake off the meat from the salt, and only then do the washing that's after the salting. Says the Rambam Malacha Yud Beis, Kol HaDvarim Ha'elu LeBasar Tzarech Levashlo. This whole procedure needs to be done only if you plan to cook the meat, because the cooking will move around the blood. Therefore, you must first extract it before you cook it. But for roast meat, all you have to do is just salt it, put a little salt around it, and roast it right away. However, if you want to eat raw meat, you must salt it according to the Rambam very well, wash it very well, and then eat it. This is argued on by some commentaries. They say that if it's raw meat, as long as you just wash the surface and get the surface blood off, it's okay to consume it without salting. If you scalded this raw meat in vinegar, right away you can eat it as it's raw, because again, the scalding will seal the blood in its place. You're even able to drink the vinegar which was used for scalding, because the vinegar doesn't extract blood, it seals it. So the vinegar itself remains pure from the blood, and you can drink the vinegar. If you used vinegar to scald meat, you shouldn't use it to scald it a second time. If a piece of meat becomes red in the vinegar didn't do its job, it's supposed to become white, seal it. It didn't seal it, it became red. Then both the meat and the vinegar remain forbidden until you first salt the meat very well, get all the meat out, and then you can roast it. Basar shehedim, if meat became particularly red, there's some extra blood in there. And also the testicles of an animal or a beast, with the membranes over them. They have a lot of blood. And also the nape of the neck, which has large blood vessels, and they're full of blood. If you cut them open and salt them properly, you can even cook them. The salting will remove all the blood in there. But if you didn't cut them, you roasted them on a spit, and you roasted the neck facing downwards, or you roasted them directly on the coals, they are all permitted. Otherwise, we're worried that the blood is not going to be fully extracted. A person roasts a head of an animal in an oven or a furnace. If he hung it with the place of its slaughtering, in other words, the opening of the neck facing downwards, mutar, that's permitted, all the blood will drain out. For the blood will go out and will drip. But if the opening of the neck, the place of the slaughtering, was open to the side, its brains remain forbidden. For all the blood will gather in there, and it won't go out. The rest of the flesh, on the bones, outside the brain, is permitted. Because that blood, even if it's open to the side, will drain off. You turn it totally upside down. The place where you slaughtered it is on top. The nose is on the bottom. If you put in some kind of a straw, a reed, to allow the nose to remain open, allowing for the blood to exit through the nostril, mutter, that's allowed, because the blood drains out. If not, the brain remains forbidden. Halacha tezvav, another law relating to roasting meat. You cannot place a utensil under roasting meat to receive the juices, even though it's fatty and could be used later, till all the redness disappears. As long as there's redness, we're worried there's traces of blood in there. What do you do though? If you're going to wait till all the redness goes, you may lose all the fat as well. So how do you kind of stay in the middle to make sure you're getting only the permitted stuff and not the forbidden stuff? What you do is you put a little salt into the utensil that you want to put under the roasting meat. Leave the utensil there till it roasts. And after the roasting thing is done, you can take any fatty substances on the top that floats to the top. But any liquid under the fat will be forbidden. We'll say there's the blood and the fat rose to the top. And it's the salt that allows for that separation to happen. A piece of bread upon which you cut roast meat, mutar la'achla, you can eat it. She'ena ela shamnunis, because anything that exudes, any liquid that exudes, is only fat, not blood. Dagim va'oifes shemolchan zeim zeh. If a person were to salt fish and birds together, afilu bikli menukav, even in a pot with holes, even in a utensil with holes. So seemingly the salt is extracting blood from both the fish and the birds. Nevertheless, hadagim asurim, the fish are prohibited. Shahadag rafe, because fish meat is softer. Ubeilei adam hayotze min ha'oif, and it will swallow the blood that comes out of the birds. Commentaries explain a little more here. There's a principle that says, "Aidi detari lemiflat loibala." When something is busy exuding, it will not absorb. So if the salt is causing the fish and the birds to exude, how would the fish, even if it's softer meat, how would it absorb any blood coming out from the birds? So the commentaries say that fish exudes all its blood much faster. So the process will be over for the fish, while it's still not over for the bird meat. And the blood coming out of the bird will be absorbed into the fish. Needless to say, if you were to salt a fish with the meat of an animal or a beast, much more blood in that meat, much faster process for the fish to exude all of its blood, leaving it lots of time to absorb blood from the meat of the animal or the beast, and forbidding the fish. Halacha Yudzayin oifes shehenichan shleimin, birds that you left complete. Umile chalalon basar ubeitzim ubishlan, and you stuff them with some stuffing, some meat, some eggs, and you cook them. Asuros, they are forbidden. Shaharei dam yetzel l'teichen, because there's going to be blood coming from the bird into them, even if you salted it. The commentary explaining you have salted on both sides. From the inside, it'll still absorb. Even if you salted it very well, it's forbidden. Even if the meat that you're stuffing it with was stewed or roasted, doesn't matter. And if you roasted the bird with the stuffing, hareelu mutaris, then it's permitted. All the blood will drain off. Even if the meat inside of it is raw and also itself has to exude its blood. And even if the opening of the stuffing is facing upwards, so you would think it wouldn't drain off, it would with the roasting. Halacha yudches b'nei meyayim, some kishke, intestines shemalan al derech zu, that you filled up in this way with a stuffing. Bebasar tzalui oy shaluk, with stewed or roast meat. Shamlan bebeitzim, or you fill them up with eggs. Ushlakan klon, and then you roasted them or stewed them. The intestines that elu mutarim, totally permitted. She'ein machazikin dam b'vnei meyayim, by default we don't presume that there's blood in the intestines. V'chein hayru ha'ga'onim, so have the ga'onim also ruled on this matter. Halacha yutes, another law related to salting and blood and meat. Oifes shetaflan bebatzei kutzlan. If you coat a bird with some dough or some flour, and you roast them, bein shleimin bein mechutachin, whether complete or cut up, im taflan b'soiles gasa, if you coated it with thicker flour, afilu hismika hatfela, even if the coating turns reddish, oicheles hatfela, you can eat the coating. Mipnei soiles gasa mispareres, because the thicker texture of the flour will cause it to crumble. The yaitze hadam, and any blood which there is there will be exuded and drained off. V'im taflan b'kem machitim shelisasan. But if you coated the bird with wheat flour that was first moistened before it was ground, then you got to keep track of the coating. If the coating remained white like silver, muter lechem, you can eat from it. There's no blood. But if not, if it loses that shade, asura, it's forbidden. There's probably some blood in there. Taflan bishar k'machim. If you used the coating with other types of flours, im hadimu asurin, im le'adimu mutarin. They don't have to reach white like silver. If they're reddish, they're forbidden. If they're not reddish, they're permitted. Halacha chav, sakin sheshachad ba, a knife that was used for slaughter, asur lachtech bareteach, cannot be used to cut anything hot. Ad sheyalaben asakin ba'ur, till you kasher, till you make the knife white hot. Oyashchizena b'mashchezes, or sharpen it fully. Oyinatzena bekarka kosher eser pamim, or stick it into tough ground 10 times. Otherwise, it's full of absorbed blood from the slaughtering, and it will reabsorb it to the meat, the hot meat that you're using to cut. After the fact, though, if you cut hot meat with it, it's permitted, because the blood will maybe not absorb after the fact. That's what we'll say. Also, a slaughtering knife should not be used to cut a radish or something sharp initially. It's very pungent. It's pungent things are like hot things, and they will cause the blood to be absorbed into them. But if you washed off the knife or cleaned it with some utensil, then you can use it to cut a radish, something like that. But again, not hot meat. Hot meat, initially you want to stay away from. The bowl that you use to salt meat, even if it was lined with lead, so it's seemingly very non-absorbing, the bowl can never be used to serve hot foods, because by virtue of the salting process, the blood was absorbed into its clay matter and is going to cause it to always have some kind of blood absorption, which will be passed on into food, into hot food, if you put it in. This reflects a general law in koshering that earthenware utensils can never be fully koshered, because they always retain some of their absorption. So here too, the clay utensil that was used for salting retains its absorptions of blood always. I should note, by the way, that what we learned today in laws of salting is very, very in short. There are full sections of laws in the Shulchan Aruch about this. It's actually studied for smicha. If you want to get a basic rabbinic ordination, you have to learn the laws of salting meat. They're much more complex and intricate than I presented them today, but we're going to leave it for a further study because we're learning the Rambam. We learn what the Rambam says and that's it, but it's good to know that there's much more than meets the eye on this topic.